This is a Studio Debrief, not a tutorial. It's where I walk you through what mattered most during this build, key choices, finishing logic, and what I learned along the way. The model is the HAMMERKNIGHT, and this one's all about the long weapon. The UBR launcher became the visual anchor for the entire project. From there, I brought in countercolor scheme borrowed from World War II armor, balanced it with a layered environmental finish, and tied the final touches together with some very effective studio shortcuts. The full start to finish breakdown with every step and photo is available in the Workbench Edition and digital guide, but here I want to show you the why behind the build. Let's get into it. To create the white countercolor pattern on the Bazooka, I deliberately used two different techniques: a thick hand-painted green-grey base to match the main body of the hammer, followed by a thin, airbrushed white overlay. That contrast in finish, heavy versus light, was part of the visual storytelling. But getting the mask right was tricky. I knew I'd probably get some tape creep, so I prepped with a bit of silicone barrier in key areas to allow for clean removal and easy fixes. That trick saved me a few headaches before. Then, to shape the soft curves, I went with a sausage of silly putty, whichever flavour of modelling putty you've got lying around. Here's where it gets a little philosophical. Most Maschinen Krieger kits are born from kit bash and sculpt, not CAD or animation design. That makes the scale feel human, so I try to match that with my painting. I sized the camo as if my hand was scaling it on a real world object, not 1/35 scale tank logic, but link finger scale logic. It maybe sounds a bit mad, but it gives the result an intuitive correctness because it's organic to how the model was made in the first place. The white countercolor camo on the Bazooka was inspired by the Sherman Firefly, a World War II British tank variant we used to talk a lot about in the studio, especially because of the unique camo scheme they applied to the barrel. It was designed to make the long barrel of the 17-pounder gun harder to detect at a distance, so enemy spotters couldn't easily tell they were facing a more dangerous version. I took that logic directly into this build. The HAMMERKNIGHT's UBR launcher is the long weapon in this team, and I wanted to treat it in the same way. Visually deceptive, but tactically serious. As soon as I thought of that link, it was settled. This was the scheme. This was the moment it all clicked. Once the white was airbrushed over the green-grey base, I took special care to spray away from the putty. I didn't want a harsh ridge or heavy step in the paint. I prefer when that edge looks a little ghosted, like the paint naturally thins towards the camo line. It feels more lived in that way. I know many of you are already confident with an airbrush, so I won't dwell here too long, but this kind of finish is where I really enjoy mixing airbrush and handbrush techniques. There's something about that contrast, the heavy brush texture next to a light airbrush haze that just looks right. It fascinates me. Now, with full honesty, I always get nervous at the reveal. I know, it says professional model on the card, but pulling off masking material, especially silly putty, gives me a bit of a panic every time. It just doesn't look sharp when it's coming off, but then, that moment when it works, and on this build it really did. The white and green combo looked even better than I imagined. Despite being borrowed straight from World War II armor, it fit perfectly on this machine. I did have a little overspray in some spots, mostly around the handguard, but I'd planned for that. The silicone barrier did its job, and I could just scrape it back with a wooden toothpick. No fussy repaint, no fake weathering to hide it, just clean, subtractive fix. Once all the masking was off, the Bazooka looked fantastic. Even if it's not the first thing people notice in the gallery shots, I know it's there, and it gave me, that little buzz we all get when a model just works. That's what I love most about this stuff. It's the craft and the moment. Let's briefly talk about the interior painting, because I know it's a hot topic for some folks. Personally, I don't go too hard on internals if they're not going to be visible. I respect the heck out of people who love detailing cockpits or painting up every cable, and if that's your jam, just do it. But for me, if I know it won't show up in the final build, I dial it back. For the HAMMERKNIGHT, I laid down a quick lacquer base coat, some airbrushed, some hand-brushed, while prepping the rest of the model. Then instead of doing a full weathering pass, I used a fast trick. I sponged on acrylics over the top. Because they're water-based and the lacquer is underneath, it gave me this subtle worn leather effect, like layers of grime that have worn down over time. It's not a showpiece finish, but that wasn't the goal. It was practical, fast, and looked great in the few interior shots I did get. To me, this is the kind of thing I brought over from professional studio work. If you can achieve a finish that reads well with minimal steps, that's not cutting corners. That's professional efficiency, and I stand by that approach today. I started my environmental effects using oil paints, specifically chosen earth tones like ochre, raw sienna, burnt umber, green shade, and buff. Before I use them, I like to place them on a bit of cardboard to leach out some of the linseed oil, which, as you know, speeds up the drying and gives them a drier, dustier texture. I keep that set up inside a basic document folder that I got from Dysol to protect them from dust while they dry out. When working on the model, I apply small dots of these oils with a toothpick, then manipulate them using a dry splayed flat brush. Some areas I leave quite sharp and clumped, while others I soften with a bit of matte effect thinner. The two styles, direct application versus thinned blending, offer different visual results. Neither is better, but used in combination, they create a more dynamic layered surface. I tend to concentrate these effects lower on the model where dirt naturally accumulates. Deeper tones like ochre and sienna go toward the feet and undersides, while the lighter tones like buff rise higher, mimicking real-world dust dispersion. I also apply contrast color theory in key places, orange-hued oils over green areas to make them pop. And I avoid strict symmetry. If one side has ochre, the other side might get buff or umber instead. It keeps the viewer's eye moving, which allows them to always be discovering new moments. The final step here is knowing when to stop. I'll often go back with a Q-tip and remove just a touch here or there. I know I always mention restraint, maybe too often, but to me it's core to getting the finish right. It's not about being subtle nor showy, it's about walking that line where something looks both intentional and organic. Beautifully restrained, but still striking. That's the goal. Once the oil effects were down and it flashed off a bit, I moved on to acrylic-based environmental products. One advantage of working this way is that acrylics are water-based. They don't disturb or reactivate the oils, so there's no need to wait for full cure time. You can layer directly over them. I started by experimenting with the Tamiya weathering sticks. I've used these for years for subtle highlights, but this time I wanted to see how they handled a heavier lift. I found that applying them directly to the model was okay, but what worked best was loading up a wet flat brush straight off the stick, then stippling that onto the surface like paint. The result was a soft, dusty layer, especially effective on the lower legs and around the hover slippers. By applying more to the rear and around the outer edges, I reinforced that real-world logic where grime builds up towards the ground. It also added a pleasing asymmetry. From there, I moved on to Vallejo's diorama mud acrylics, specifically their light brown mud and European earth tones. These are gel-based pastes, more often used on bases, but I applied them directly to the model. Using a wand brush, I dabbed them in at key spots and stippled them out just enough to create texture. These acrylic muds have a bit of inherent chunkiness, like real compacted dirt, so I didn't need to apply pigments or powders. And by switching between the lighter and darker tones across different zones, I got a layered natural feel. In some areas, I thinned the mud slightly with water, then went over it with a dry flat brush to absorb moisture and soften the edge, mimicking the way splashed mud dries over time. It's a subtle, real-world reference, not a dramatic showpiece, but it adds texture where it counts. For the final stage of the build, I turn to the leg pipes. One of those elements that looks simple, but it can cause real trouble if not planned out. I clipped off the standard pegs so I could insert the pipes after painting and weathering. That way, they wouldn't interfere with all of the layered effects built up earlier. To secure them, I used one of the Vallejo texture acrylics again, this time black lava asphalt. Not just for looks, but as a functioning glue. With a slightly damp round brush, I applied it around the insertion point. The paste holds the pipe in place whilst also giving the impression of heavy mechanical grease seeping from the joint. Once cured, I enhanced the effect using Tamiya Smoke X19, a glassy enamel I just love for simulating grease, oil and fuel stains. I applied it generously around the joint and over the cured texture paste to add life and depth. In some areas I applied it thick. In other areas I thinned it down with enamel thinner for streaking. The result is one of the most convincing GOFS effects, that's grease, oil, fuel stain, I've ever gotten on an Ma.K suit. Finally, I weathered the pipes themselves, which are made from that slightly flexible plastic that people often avoid painting. I skipped primer and went straight in with oil paints, which remain flexible and bond surprisingly well. For color, I used red and blue to reflect the suit's accent tones and buff, dust, to tone and age them down. The red picks up on highlights already present in the HAMMERKNIGHT, the blue adds shadow richness, and the dust ties it back into the environmental finish. It's subtle, but that's intentional. The pipes aren't meant to be the focus. They're a visual weight to balance the top-heavy silhouette of the suit, not a showcase element. And by using the now cured hover slipper rim as a handle, I could apply all of this without damaging previous effects. It's a great example of how thinking ahead makes every stage smoother and every finish stronger. So that's the build, from the Bazooka concept through masking, weathering and into the final leg pipe install. What you've seen here are the choices and decisions that shape the finish, but the full technical process from materials to final photos is documented step by step in the Workbench Edition and digital guide. If you're working on your own HAMMERKNIGHT or similar models, or just want to see how I built mine, you can grab that directly from my store. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next debrief.